So with regards to a temple that could be rebuilt and that likely will be rebuilt, we're talking about Jewish people who have rejected Christ as the Messiah and are ripe for embracing the false Messiah, Antichrist, and his agenda, etc., etc. On the other hand, we have to remember that this third temple or interim temple or 70th week temple is something that's designed to only last the duration of the 70th week. It is not to be confused with Ezekiel's temple / Messiah's millennial temple. So, just keep those details in mind as we're reading through these notes. Let's continue reading Joel Richardson. He says, quote, "But probably the most amazing aspect of this treaty that the Mahdi makes with this Jew of priestly lineage is its time frame." So we're talking about the 70th week of Daniel. He says the specific time frame given by Muslim authorities, I might add, for the treaty is exactly the same as the Antichrist's peace treaty, which is what? 7 years. So, citing hadith, which speak of the Mahdi's emergence and rule, Muhammad Ali ibn Zubair relates this amazing tradition. So we have a quote from a modern or a later, I should say, I'm not sure when this gentleman lived, but someone who's not Muhammad himself. But here's what he has to say concerning Islamic prophecy, eschatology. The prophet, speaking of Muhammad, the prophet said there will be 4 peace agreements between you and the Romans. Again, remember, Romans there is just a word used by Islamic authorities or writers to describe anyone who's not Muslim in this context. A 4 peace agreements between you and the Romans. The 4th will be mediated through a person who will be from the progeny of, scroll up there, from the progeny of Hadrat Aaron, i.e. Honorable Aaron, i.e. the brother of Moses, the biblical Aaron and Moses, and will be upheld for 7 years. So this is an interesting parallel to the biblical data that we're already familiar with as prophecy students. This Muslim specialist continues, the people asked, quote, "O Prophet Muhammad, who will be the Imam, i.e. the leader of the people at that time?" And the quote finishes by saying, the prophet said, "He will be from my progeny and will be exactly 40 years of age. His face will shine like a star," etc., etc. And so the quote leaves off there. So we have this descendant of Muhammad, according to some eschatology experts in Islamic circles, who will be this final 12th Imam who will come in and usher in this 7-year peace treaty with the Romans, i.e. the non-Muslims. And there's the parallel that we're looking at with end time prophetic details. Let's keep going. We've got about 15 minutes left in our study, and we're making some pretty good time. Let's begin to talk now about the biblical idea of changing the laws and times. And we've read this kind of wording in the book of Daniel itself, right? He will think of changing times and laws. Joel continues, another of the Antichrist's goals, according to the book of Daniel, just like I mentioned, is said to be that he will try to, quote, change the set times and laws, end quote. So let's see if there is some parallel. Let's first read Daniel's notes. This is Daniel 7:25. Speaking of the Antichrist, he will speak against the Most High and oppress his saints and try to change the set times and the laws. The saints will be handed over to him for a time, times, and half a time. That's Daniel 7:25. I might interject before I read Mr. Richardson's notes on this particular passage. I might interject that, we'll see if he talks about it, but I'm trying to do it before he talks. When I research the European model of the Antichrist, i.e. the non-Islamic model, I have found that many Bible prophecy teachers believe that when Daniel talks about the Antichrist changing times and laws and things like that, that often they believe that the Antichrist will try to change the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday or something like that, and thus the picture that many people paint of the Antichrist is someone who resembles a pope, because there's the sentiment that it was the Catholic Church that rejected the Jewish Saturday Sabbath historically and changed it over to Sunday, and so we have some sort of Antichrist figure who parallels a Pope figure. And of course, this is really popular in some Christian circles, more notably, maybe I believe, if I remember, Seventh-day Adventist, Ellen G. White type of end-time prophecy perspectives. I don't prescribe to that particular perspective, although I do find it an interesting fact of history, and it could play an interesting detail in regards to if the Islamic Antichrist turns out to be the one that hits the scene, which I think there's a strong probability that it could be an Islamic figure that is the Antichrist figure, the Mahdi, etc., etc. If that ends up being the case, then he certainly is not friendly towards Jewish times and laws. He's decidedly anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic and anti-Bible, so that might kind of play right into his hand, where he might be thinking, okay, let's just change all of the set biblical times that are lined out for the Jewish people and just change them into something else. So let's see how Joel Richardson interacts with this information from the book of Daniel. Joel says, this is actually quite a big hint into the person of the Antichrist, speaking about the changing of the times and laws. For by his actions, we see a hint of his origin, right? It's said that he will desire to change two things, times and laws. Now, we have already seen that the Mahdi will change the law by instituting the Islamic Sharia law, right? You've heard of that Sharia law. By instituting this Sharia law all over the earth, but we have not seen any evidence in Islamic apocalyptic literature of him. What we've not seen is any sign or evidence of him changing the times. So there's one thing to establish law, it's another thing to change the times. Joel says the simple question, however, is who else other than a Muslim would desire to change the times and laws? Besides the Gregorian calendar used by the West, Mr. Richardson comments that there's also a Jewish, a Hindu, and a Muslim calendar, among others. So we're looking at this from maybe a global perspective. Jews or Hindus, however, are not a people who would desire to impose their religious laws or calendars onto the rest of the world. Islam, however, does have both its own laws and its own calendar, both of which it would desire to impose onto the entire world, according to their eschatological prophecies. Joel continues, the Islamic calendar is based on the career of Muhammad. It begins at the migration, the hijrah, of Muhammad from Mecca to Medina. The Muslim calendar is viewed, he says, as being mandatory for all to observe. Of course, he means all Muslims, but eventually if Islam rules the world one day, then it will be everybody. Dr. Walid Mahana articulates the Islamic position regarding the Islamic hijrah, I think I'm probably mispronouncing that, the Hijrah calendar. Might be Hydra, but I think it's Hijra. All right, so let's look at this quote from, again, another Islamic specialist. Quote, it is considered a divine command to use a calendar with 12 purely lunar months without intercalculation as evident from the Holy Quran. And we already know that the Islamic calendar, if you've ever kind of taken note or observed that Ramadan usually falls on a different month every year, is because there's no intercalculation that would adjust their calendar so that Ramadan stayed positioned within one season, like happens in Israel's calendars, right? God commanded Moses to command the Israelites to observe Passover in the springtime of the year. And yet, because of the differences between the rotation of the earth around the sun and the rotation of the earth on its own axis in conjunction with the sightings of the moon marking off the months, then we have months that need to be adjusted using leap years in Jewish reckoning in order to make sure that Passover stays in the springtime of year. If we didn't do that, if we didn't intercalculate, then similar to Islam and Ramadan, Passover would wander throughout the year and would actually leave the spot of the spring and eventually wander into summer and then into fall and then into winter and then back around into spring again within a space of, I think, like either 6 years or 12 years. Or I'm just pulling this details from memory. But trust me, at least on the general idea that the Jewish calendar has to be intercalculated. It has to be adjusted with leap years and leap months, right? Adding an extra month, an extra Adar, so that we end up with two of them in some years. Adar Aleph and Adar Bet is the Jewish month, Adar, Adar. So if we didn't do that in Judaism, then we would have wandering season or wandering calendar observances. Well, Islam doesn't do that. They don't intercalculate. They just let the months be reckoned according to the moon. So for that reason, Ramadan wanders through the year. I mention that because it's not fixed according to either a date, like Nisan 14th Passover, or fixed according to a day, like, for instance, say, Easter is fixed according to a day. So let's read Joel Richardson's notes on this phenomenon about changing times and laws. Not only, he says, does Islam view as a divine imperative the use of a unique religious calendar, it also has its own week. Unlike the Western rhythm of a week, Monday through Friday being the body of the work week, followed by Saturday and Sunday as the weekend, with Judaism and Christianity using these 2 days that we already know, 2 of these days for their respective days of worship. Islam holds Friday as its sacred day of prayer. So we can kind of see that. Friday is the religious day for Islam, Saturday is the religious day for Jews, and Sunday is the religious day for Christians. Joel continues, this is the day, speaking of Friday, it's the day that Muslims meet at the mosque to pray and to listen to a sermon. So that's no secret so far. Let's keep reading his notes. Thus, he says it's quite plausible that the biblical reference to the Antichrist who will, quote, try to change the set times and laws, like we read about in Daniel up above. So that's our quote from Daniel. He says it's plausible that it is a Muslim who will be trying to change the times and laws. Now, again, he's just speculating. He says it's plausible. He's not saying it's definitive. He goes on to say that as we look at the full picture, only Islam fits the bill of a system that has its own unique calendar and week based on its own religious history and a clear system of law that Joel says wishes to impose upon the entire earth. So I find that to be an interesting sort of set of details that, given the weight of the possibility / probability of the Antichrist fitting into the Islamic model like we're discussing, that this parallel of where Daniel talks about changing the times and laws on a worldwide scale, since it is Antichrist who's seeking to establish his one world government, his new world order, etc., that it is interesting that Islam has already prepped him or prepared the way, unwittingly and unknowingly probably, for such a change to be implemented, such a program to be put into practice. Let's keep reading Joel Richardson. Surely, he says, if a Muslim ever emerges who is as powerful as the Mahdi is described as being, right, we're talking about Antichrist, then he will certainly attempt to institute both the Islamic law worldwide and the Islamic calendar and week as well. So those are details that I think every Christian should sit up and listen to, at least even if you're not in agreement, full agreement that the Antichrist is going to be a Muslim or that Islam is going to actually rule the world one day for a while during the 7th week. If this tends to play out, if this is going to play out the way that Joel is thinking that it will, and that Islam hopes that it will, so if he's right, it's the point I'm trying to make, then if I read the book of Revelation correctly and the rest of the Bible correctly, then even if Islam does rule the world one day, it'll only be for kind of like a short 3.5 years. It'll be a very short stint. So, and that's, you know, that's I don't know what to make of of those details per se, why it's only 3.5 years before Satan goes on this intense rampage and just starts killing anyone and everyone who opposes him, including religious institutions, right? He seeks to somehow institute his own brand of religion. Now, it could be misreading those prophecies, and we're drawing to a close. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left in the study here, so winding things down. It could be that the Antichrist decides to continue to allow Islam to have a prominent place in his scheme of things. It could be that instead of the first 3.5 years, that maybe it's the last 3.5 years. So I could get that backwards, because I mean, how does that coincide with allowing Israel to establish a temple structure on the Temple Mount? If, in the first 3.5 years, if it's Islam that's supposed to be dominating the world during 3.5 years, right? There seems to be some conflict there. Maybe it's that for the first 3.5 years, he allows some form of ecumenical brand of religion to rule the world. For the first 3.5 years, where he kind of facilitates and tricks all, or allows, not really tricking, but allowing all the religions to coexist together peaceably and do their own thing for the first 3.5 years. And then at the midpoint, when he turns on everybody, including Israel, if it's an Islamic leader there in that top position of Antichrist ruling the world, the Mahdi, the 12th Imam, then it would be at the midpoint when Islam begins its worldwide domination and rulership. And so it would be the last 3.5 years where Islam would be imposing kind of worldwide religious restrictions and mandates and things like that. So instead of the first 3.5, it'd be I think that's probably more plausible when I consider all the facts and put them all on the table, and consider that Satan, when he declares himself to be God, isn't necessarily maybe throwing Islam under the bus. Maybe he's allowing Islam to be that top religion underneath him, where he himself is declaring God. But again, there are details that are very difficult to ascertain how they're going to play out if he's declaring himself to be God and opposing every religious object or worship that's shown to be God. Wouldn't this run into a conflict with Islam as well, who worships Allah and gives high praise to Muhammad? Wouldn't they resist the Antichrist if he says, hey, I'm God? I mean, is their Imam going to declare himself to be Allah? Is that how that works out? Right? Is the Mahdi going to say, I'm Allah incarnate? You know, which Islam doesn't believe in the incarnation, at least from the biblical model. So things are going to start getting, sooner or later, getting very particular, and we as Bible students are just going to have to be on our toes. I'm not saying you have to go out and pick up a copy of the Quran and read it for yourself so that you can be better prepared for these end time scenarios. I'm actually saying don't do that, right? You don't need to do that. What I am saying you need to do is begin to read your Bible and to begin to make it a priority to make your relationship with God real, genuine. And this can only take place, and I'm saying this in closing because it's of primary importance, and I'll close my study with this. It is of paramount and primary importance that we Christians make it a priority to have a relationship with Yeshua, the real Christ, the genuine Messiah, not the Antichrist, not the false Christ, not the replacement one, not the Mahdi, not the 12th Imam, not the European guy that's going to show up if it's going to be that guy. We need to have a relationship with the real Jesus, right? The real Yeshua. And you can only find him in the pages of the Bible. You can't find him in a mosque per se, right? He's not found in the pages of the Quran. That's not the true Jesus. That's a Jesus that's been fabricated by an enemy of Christianity. So you need to have a relationship with the true Jesus, and you need to immerse yourself in his words, and that's the Bible. That's the truth. So make that your priority. And all of these other details, as God deems it necessary, he'll reveal those details for you. And Yeshua even promised that the Holy Spirit would give us the right words to say when the time comes, if you're hauled in before the opposing authorities and questioned and put on trial for your faith. At that time, Yeshua said, I will give you a mouth to speak. My Spirit, i.e. the Holy Spirit, he will be speaking for you. So don't worry too much about that. Your faith just needs to be in Yeshua. So for the rest of the world who has no relationship with God and no relationship with Yeshua, I'm sorry to say, but you're already primed to accept the lie of the Antichrist, no matter if he comes from a European model or an Islamic model. It doesn't matter. You're already in a position where you're going to be duped, where you're going to be deceived, where you're going to be fooled, where your heart is going to be hardened by God himself into believing the delusion that God's going to send, the strong lie, the strong delusion that Paul talks about in Thessalonian letters. God himself will send this strong delusion. So you're going to have the very God of the universe resisting you and opposing you. Plus, you have the second most powerful being in the universe, Satan himself, extending his influence, beginning in Jerusalem and extending out to the rest of the world. So you're going to be in a very, very bad place, between a rock and a hard place, in the most worst way possible, because you've rejected the love of the truth, like Paul talks about in the book of Romans, and then echoes again in the books to the Thessalonians. So that's going to do it for our look at eschatology, a biblical study of end time events.